December 1941. America had just entered the war, and Henry Ford, 78 years old, stubborn as ever, stood on a stretch of frozen farmland outside Ypsilanti, Michigan. The ground was hard as iron, the wind sharp enough to cut skin. There was nothing here but mud, frost, and silence. Yet Ford looked out at the empty field and told his engineers, "This is where we'll build the factory that wins the war." The generals in Washington didn't believe him. "You can't mass-produce airplanes like Model Ts," one said, flipping through Ford's blueprints as if they were science fiction. "Bombers aren't cars. Everyone's different, handmade, complex, impossible to standardize." Ford's answer was simple. "Then we'll make them all the same." The room had gone quiet. Someone coughed. Then a colonel muttered, "You'll never build a bomber an hour." Ford just smiled. "Watch me." The plan was insane, even by wartime standards. A 1.25-mile-long factory, a river of steel and workers, where thousands of parts would flow down an assembly line, not for sedans, but for warplanes. The B-24 Liberator, a 20-ton bomber with 450,000 components, 313,000 rivets, and a wingspan wide enough to cover a baseball diamond. Ford's son, Edsel, younger and gentler, tried to temper expectations. "We'll try," he said at the first press conference. "It may take time." But the elder Ford, his voice cracking with age and pride, declared, "We will build a bomber every 60 minutes. The reporters laughed. One headline the next day read, "Henry Ford promises the moon and a bomber an hour." Still, the project began. Bulldozers crawled across the frozen fields, carving a foundation out of the mud. Engineers from Detroit arrived in heavy coats and hard hats, setting up makeshift offices in wooden shacks with stoves burning coal. The air smelled of diesel and frost. By February, the blueprints had multiplied. Miles of corridors, hangars the size of cathedrals, assembly halls that could swallow entire city blocks. "We're building a factory the size of a city," one architect wrote to his wife. "And it feels like we're building it out of thin air." But behind the optimism was chaos. Labor was short. Materials were scarcer still. Steel shipments vanished to other war contracts. Rubber was rationed. Skilled aircraft workers were already employed elsewhere, so Ford began recruiting farmers, mechanics, even high school graduates who'd never touched an airplane part in their lives. The Army Air Forces sent inspectors weekly. Most of them left shaking their heads. "This is a dream," one wrote in his report. "A magnificent dream, but it will fail." Still, the Fords refused to stop. By spring, the first skeletal frame of the factory rose against the Michigan sky, a web of girders stretching farther than the eye could see. Henry Ford visited the site in his black Lincoln, stepping out with a cane and an old brown overcoat. Reporters followed him as he walked along the icy ground, his shoes sinking in the mud. "You see," he said, pointing toward the horizon, "that's not mud. That's America." The workers called it the Big Gamble. The government called it Project Willow Run. For Ford, it was something else entirely, redemption. His Model T had once mobilized a nation. Now he meant to do it again, not with cars, but with machines of war. But nothing about Willow Run came easy. The winter storms froze the cement. Floodwaters swallowed the trenches. Workers built scaffolding by lantern light, shoveling snow before sunrise, laying concrete after midnight. They called it the city that never slept, though there were no buildings yet, only tents, machinery, and a dream. In his private notebook, Edsel Ford wrote, "They say it can't be done, but we're too far in to stop. Every man here believes he's building the future, or dying trying." Washington grew restless. The deadline slipped. The first test structures collapsed under their own weight. At a meeting with the War Department, Ford's engineers were grilled for hours. "When will we see a plane?" an officer demanded. "You've built everything except an airplane." The answer came quietly from Sorensen, Ford's production chief. "We're building the ground first. The planes will follow." By late summer, the shell of the factory was finished. From the air, it looked like a giant letter L, one arm stretching over a mile long. Inside, it was cavernous, echoing, alive with the smell of oil and new steel. Conveyor belts ran like veins through its body. Giant presses stamped aluminum panels with a thunder that shook the floor. But the first B-24 didn't roll out until September 1942, more than a year behind schedule. And when it did, it was riddled with defects. The Army inspectors refused delivery. "It flies," one of them said dryly, "but not for long." Still, even that failure felt like progress. One worker later recalled, "When that first plane rose off the runway, the whole factory stopped. We watched it disappear into the clouds. Some of us cried. It wasn't perfect, but it flew, and we knew we'd get it right." Henry Ford, standing on the observation deck, said nothing. He just watched the bomber fade into the horizon, the wind tugging at his hat. Then he turned to Edsel and whispered, "Now we know it can be done." Outside, the snow was falling again. The fields around Willow Run were no longer empty. They pulsed with engines, lights, and movement. The mud had become a miracle, but the miracle had only begun. Because before Ford could build a bomber every hour, he had to build a city out of steel, sweat, and hope. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. At night, Willow Run glowed brighter than Detroit. From miles away, truck drivers could see its silver roof reflecting the moon, its smokestacks breathing fire into the cold Michigan air. Inside, the roar was endless. The hiss of welding torches, the thunder of metal presses, the rhythm of boots on concrete. It wasn't a factory anymore. It was alive. By early 1942, Willow Run had become the beating heart of America's war machine. 40,000 workers flooded through its gates every day, arriving in convoys of buses from towns as far as Ohio. The parking lots stretched for acres, filled with Fords, Chevrolets, and bicycles left leaning against fences. Everyone came for the same reason, to build bombers. But they weren't soldiers. They were housewives, clerks, farmhands, and machinists who had never seen an aircraft up close. The training lasted days, not months. Mistakes were inevitable. Rivets were misaligned, panels bent, engines jammed. One supervisor joked grimly, "We're losing more planes in here than they are over Europe." Still, the line moved. Always forward. The noise never stopped. Machines pounded out rhythms that made your bones ache. Workers shouted to be heard, their voices swallowed by the sound of progress. Sweat and oil hung in the air like fog. "We didn't have days," one woman recalled. "We had shifts." Her name was Mary Johnson, 23, from a small town near Lansing. She worked on the wing assembly team, drilling holes through aluminum ribs. Her gloves were too big. Her arms were covered in bruises. But she never missed a shift. In her diary, found years later, she wrote, "We're all strangers here. But when the whistle blows, we move like one body. It feels like war. Only our battlefield is the line." Women like Mary made up a third of the workforce. Some brought their children, who stayed in makeshift nurseries set up inside old trailers. The men, many too old or unfit for combat, worked double shifts, driven by duty or desperation. They called themselves the Other Army. Ford's dream was becoming real, but the price was exhaustion. The cafeteria ran 24 hours a day. Lines for food snaked past the factory walls. Fights broke out over places to sleep in the nearby barracks. Rent was high, tempers higher. In Ford City, the shantytown built near the plant, lights stayed on all night, babies cried, radios blared, and trains thundered past every few minutes. "We built bombers," a machinist said later, "but we lived like miners." Winter made everything worse. Ice formed on the inside of windows, steam pipes burst. The buses that carried workers often froze on the road, leaving people to walk miles through snow before dawn. Yet every morning, the gates opened again, and the factory swallowed them whole. Henry Ford himself rarely appeared anymore. The work had grown too big, too chaotic. His son Edsel oversaw most operations now, though his health was failing. He walked the factory floor in a long coat and fedora, coughing quietly into a handkerchief. "Keep faith," he would say to the crews, forcing a smile. "Every hour we build one plane closer to peace." But peace felt distant. The first bombers that rolled off the line were disasters. Some failed inspection before ever leaving the hangar. Others cracked during test flights. The press was merciless. Headlines mocked Ford's flying fiasco. Congress began to question the project. How could the master of the automobile fail to make a plane? Inside Willow Run, morale sank. Workers whispered that they were wasting their lives. Mechanics quit by the dozens. Engineers argued through sleepless nights. "It's too big," one foreman said. "It's too fast." We build a monster that can't feed itself. Yet others refused to give up. They improvised, learned, and adapted. A young supervisor rigged a conveyor to move fuselage panels faster. A group of women discovered a new way to align the tail sections, saving precious minutes. Innovation was born from desperation. The spirit of Detroit, that relentless, noisy pride, began to seep into Willow Run's walls. One night, when an engine test shattered a glass partition, the shift foreman shouted over the noise, "If it's shaking, it's working." The line cheered. Production improved, but chaos still ruled. Deliveries of parts arrived late. Some workers passed out from the heat. The temperature in the press hall reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It smelled like metal and sweat and fear, a welder remembered. But we knew every rivet meant another man might come home alive. There were small victories. The first B-24 that passed inspection was named Spirit of Willow Run. The workers gathered outside to watch it take off, waving greasy hats and handkerchiefs as it lifted into the dawn. Someone started singing, "God Bless America." Others joined in, their voices hoarse and proud. But beneath the celebration, another truth lingered: the factory was falling behind. The war was accelerating, and Washington demanded more planes than ever. Ford's promise of a bomber an hour still seemed like fantasy. Edsel Ford wrote in his log that night, "The machines are ready. The people are ready. The system is not." He wasn't wrong. The floor was too crowded. The flow of production broke down at every turn. One section of the line finished its work hours before the next was ready. Stacks of unfinished parts piled up like monuments to confusion. In the corner office, a message from the War Department arrived, stamped urgent. Ford production critically below target. Immediate correction required. No one knew how to fix it, until one man stepped off a train from Dearborn, a man the workers called Cast Iron Charlie. He was old school, tough as the machines he built, and he didn't waste words. He walked through the chaos, hands in his pockets, watching every movement. Then, after an hour, he said quietly, "We'll tear it down and start over." And that was when everything began to change. When Charles Sorensen walked into Willow Run, he didn't talk. He just looked. The workers paused as he passed. A short, broad man with a thick jaw, oil-stained hands, and a stare that could bend steel. They called him Cast Iron Charlie, and for 30 years he'd been Henry Ford's hammer, the man who had turned assembly into an art form. By the spring of 1943, the dream of Willow Run was falling apart. Production was chaos. The floor was a maze of parts, crates, and men tripping over each other. Bombers sat half-finished in every corner. The War Department threatened to take over the plant entirely. Morale was gone. "We're drowning in airplanes," a supervisor said, "and none of them can fly." Sorensen didn't yell. He didn't hold meetings. He just walked the entire length of the mile-long factory, his boots echoing against concrete. He stopped by the wings section, watched a woman trying to rivet a panel. The template didn't fit. She looked up at him nervously. Sorensen crouched down, adjusted the frame, then said quietly, "You can't build anything straight if the table isn't level." Then he stood and left. That night, he gathered the department heads in the cafeteria. No notes, no speeches, just one sentence. "We're starting over." The room went silent. One engineer protested, "You can't shut down a line this big." Sorensen stared him down. "Then we'll die trying." And he meant it. The next morning, the plant stopped. For the first time in months, the noise died. The presses cooled. Men stood on the catwalks, looking down at the silent factory that had nearly eaten them alive. Sorensen climbed onto a crate and addressed them. "You built cars once," he said. "You know rhythm, flow, balance. This place forgot that. We'll build it back, one motion at a time." He stripped the line bare. Workers hauled out equipment, cleared space, repainted the floors. Engineers mapped every process, every turn of a wrench, every step a worker took. Then Sorensen rebuilt the line the only way he knew how, like a car factory. He broke the B-24 into thousands of tiny operations. One man drilling holes, another installing bolts, another checking alignment. Each job timed to the second. "No one builds a bomber," he told them. "We build pieces. The plane builds itself." The change was instant. The chaos faded into rhythm. Tools were standardized, steps simplified, movement reduced. Instead of walking 20 feet for a part, a worker now reached out an arm. It was like a dance, one woman said later. And Sorensen was the conductor. Within weeks, production doubled. Within months, it tripled. Ford's dream was suddenly alive again. But it came at a cost. The pressure was brutal. Deadlines were sacred. Sorensen prowled the floor at all hours, appearing without warning. He'd check bolts with his bare fingers, count seconds between tasks, then bark, "Too slow," and walk away. Men feared him, but they also followed him. Because for the first time, Willow Run worked. By July 1943, the line was rolling smoothly. The sight of it was something out of science fiction. Bombers sliding nose to tail through the glowing factory. Workers moving in perfect rhythm, sparks raining from overhead cranes. In one section, wings met fuselages. In another, tail sections lowered like puzzle pieces. At the final stage, the planes rolled toward the giant hangar doors, ready to take flight. On August 4th, Sorensen stood with his clipboard and stopwatch as bomber number 500 taxied out. He looked at his watch, 63 minutes from start to finish. The impossible promise was now real. The newspapers changed their tune overnight. Ford Factory delivers a bomber an hour. Washington called it a miracle. Sorensen didn't. "It's not a miracle," he told a reporter. "It's a schedule." But the schedule was merciless. The line ran 24 hours a day. Workers collapsed from exhaustion, some asleep on benches during breaks. The cafeteria stayed open all night, serving soup and black coffee to keep people awake. In Ford City, where the workers lived, lights burned through the small hours, families waiting for husbands, wives, sons to return from their shifts. The planes, though, never stopped. They rose from the runway one by one, silver and massive, vanishing into the clouds toward war. Henry Ford, now too old to travel often, sent a letter of congratulations. Edsel Ford, frail and sick, visited in person. He watched a bomber lift off and whispered to Sorensen, "We did it." Sorensen only nodded. He knew the truth. They'd done it. But the cost was written in every tired face on that floor. The war demanded more. Always more. "We're not fighting the Germans here," Sorensen said one night, watching the assembly line run under the factory lights. "We're fighting the clock." And it was true. The machines never slept. The men barely did. The line moved on, hour after hour, like a living thing with a heartbeat of metal and fire. But as Willow Run reached its peak, one bomber every 60 minutes, a new enemy crept in. Not one they could see or measure, but one that grew quietly in every corner of the plant. Fatigue, burnout, the slow unraveling of bodies and minds pushed beyond endurance. Because while Ford's bombers filled the skies, the people who built them were running out of time. Every hour, a new bomber. Every hour, someone collapsed. By the summer of 1943, Willow Run never slept. The heat inside the plant was suffocating, thick with the smell of oil, metal dust, and sweat. Sparks from the welding torches rained down like orange snow. The noise, hammering, riveting, shouting, was constant, a heartbeat made of steel. Even miles away, people said they could feel the ground hum at night. The rhythm was relentless. 10-hour shifts turned into 12. Weekends vanished. The clocks on the walls meant nothing. They only marked the pace of production. "We don't make planes anymore," one mechanic joked, wiping soot from his face. "We make time." But behind every joke was exhaustion. Workers fainted at their stations, dropping amid the roar of machines. Others stumbled into the medical tent, hands burned, eyes red from lack of sleep. One woman wrote in her diary, "I can still hear the engines in my sleep. They never stop." Still, no one slowed down. The war was hungry, and Willow Run fed it. By July, the factory was producing more than 20 bombers a day, one every 60 minutes. Each plane took 1,225,000 parts, all built and fitted with mathematical precision. The B-24s rolled down the line like silver whales, their aluminum skins gleaming under the factory lights. When the final bolts were tightened and the engines fired, a deep tremor shook the floor. The workers would pause, wipe their foreheads, and watch through the hangar doors as another giant roared into the sky. Some smiled. Others didn't. They were too tired to feel pride. Outside, buses lined up to take workers back to Ford City, the ramshackle settlement that had grown like a shadow around the factory. The houses were small, built fast, and always full. In the evenings, People slept in turns. Babies cried through thin walls. Radios murmured news from overseas, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio. Our boys are flying Ford's bombers, the announcers said. But in the workers' minds, the war felt far away, unreal, a blur beyond the walls. And yet, every aircraft they built was part of that distant struggle. In the skies over Europe, B-24 liberators from Willow Run flew missions that changed the course of the war, bombing oil fields, supply lines, and submarine bases. Pilots called them the heartbeat of freedom. Many never came back. Letters began to arrive at the factory, messages from crews saved by the planes these men and women built. One pilot wrote, "When flak tore through our wing, she held together. Tell the folks at Willow Run, they build angels." The letters were read aloud in the cafeteria. For a moment, people smiled again. Then the whistle blew, and the rhythm resumed. Inside, Sorensen's system ran like clockwork. Every motion timed, every movement rehearsed. The assembly ballet, the newspapers called it. To the workers, it was closer to trench warfare. Hands blistered, spines ached, ears rang long after they left the line. You couldn't talk at home, one worker recalled. The sound was still inside you. Accidents were common. Tools slipped, machines jammed, rivets misfired. A man once lost consciousness standing up. His partner caught him before he hit the floor and kept riveting. They didn't stop the line. You never stopped the line. By autumn, the factory's rhythm had become its own kind of war. People measured time not by calendars, but by bombers. 1, 2, 1,000. The supervisors tracked progress on chalkboards, drawing stars for each milestone. At 5,000, someone brought a cake. No one ate it. "We worked ourselves past tired," Mary Johnson later said. "We were too proud to stop and too scared to fail." Even the radio broadcasts couldn't keep up. Another record, the announcer said. Ford's Willow Run builds more planes than all of Germany. The workers cheered for a moment, then returned to their drills. The noise inside the plant rose and fell like the tide. You could hear laughter 1 minute, coughing the next. In the break rooms, some workers slept sitting up, heads resting on toolboxes. Others smoked in silence, their fingers trembling. The faces changed as the shifts turned, day to night to day, but the rhythm stayed the same. It wasn't just production. It was endurance. The War Department sent medals, photographs, thank you notes. Ford's executives made speeches about efficiency, freedom, and the American spirit. But on the factory floor, people just wanted air. One foreman said, "We're building the greatest machine in the world, and it's eating us alive." Still, the bombers kept coming. Day after day, the line rolled forward. Steel, sweat, and sacrifice turned into wings. And as each B-24 climbed into the sky, one truth hung in the air like the smoke from the furnaces. With every bomber that took off, the people of Willow Run were falling apart. We were winning the war, but losing ourselves. By the winter of 1944, Willow Run looked less like a factory and more like a battlefield that never slept. The snow outside turned gray with soot, and the air inside was so thick with exhaust and metal dust that workers carried handkerchiefs to breathe through. The walls trembled from the constant pounding of presses. The rhythm that had once felt like pride now sounded like punishment. The numbers told one story: success. 650 bombers a month. One every hour. Newspapers called it the miracle of Willow Run. Ford executives smiled in photographs, standing beside perfect rows of silver planes. But inside the plant, the people behind the miracle were breaking. Men collapsed at their stations. Women fainted from heat and hunger. "We didn't eat meals anymore," recalled one worker. "We refueled." Mary Johnson, the young riveter, had become a shift leader by then. Her hands were scarred, her hearing half gone. In her small notebook, she wrote, "We stand beside the planes that go to Europe and wonder if they'll ever come back. I pray each one finds its way home. Maybe one of them will bring this war to an end." The workers no longer talked about victory. They talked about survival. Medical reports began to pile up. Fatigue, infections, nervous breakdowns. The plant doctor, Dr. Harris, wrote in a confidential memo to management. "They work like soldiers and fall like them too." But the orders from Washington kept coming. Faster, bigger, louder. Production targets rose even as the people fell. The Ford Hospital unit, a wing of the company's medical service, turned into an emergency ward. Some patients were too tired to walk. Others came in with hands shaking uncontrollably, unable to hold tools. It wasn't war wounds, Harris said later. It was war made of ours. Still, no one dared stop. Patriotism, guilt, pride, call it what you will, drove them forward. The posters on the walls screamed, "Keep him flying." The foreman shouted, "You quit. You kill a pilot." So they stayed. By spring, the war in Europe was turning. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Germans were retreating, and the B-24s built at Willow Run led the bombing runs over enemy strongholds. Crews wrote back to Michigan, sending photos of their planes. Names like Ford Flyer, Rosie's Revenge, Spirit of Detroit. One message read, "Tell the workers, we flew through hell and came back. Your bomber did her job." The letters lifted spirits for a day, maybe two. Then the fatigue returned. Outside, the fields around the plant had turned to mud. The workers trudged through it before dawn, boots slipping, eyes half closed. The cafeteria served watery soup and coffee strong enough to sting. Cigarette smoke filled the rest halls. Some people slept through their breaks, heads resting on toolboxes. The war had become a cycle. Wake, work, repeat. The turnover rate skyrocketed. Hundreds quit each month, only to be replaced by others just as desperate for work. Ford recruiters went town to town, offering high wages and patriotic duty. But no one mentioned what that duty cost. Edsel Ford's health was failing. He rarely visited now, sending notes instead. One message read, "You are not just building bombers. You are building history." Few saw it as history. To them, it was survival in slow motion. Even Sorensen began to change. Once the unstoppable cast-iron Charlie, he now walked slower, his shoulders bent. He spoke less, though when he did, his words carried the same weight. "We've beaten every record," he said one night, staring at the glowing line of planes. "But we can't beat human limits forever." Still, the machines ran. The clock ticked. By April 1944, Willow Run reached its peak, 650 bombers a month. The sky above Michigan filled with their thunder. Each one was a symbol of power, of victory, of what America could do when it refused to stop. But for those inside the plant, the victory felt hollow. Mary Johnson described it best in a letter found decades later. "We won't remember the noise or the medals. We'll remember the faces beside us. The ones who stayed, the ones who couldn't, the ones who gave everything just to keep the line moving." That spring, as Allied troops pushed into France, a telegram arrived from Washington, short, official, and heavy with finality. Production goals met. Prepare to reduce operations post-VE Day. The message spread through the plant like an echo. Some cheered. Others just stood still, unsure how to feel. For years they'd lived by the rhythm of the machines. Now, suddenly, the rhythm would stop. But none of them knew what would replace it. The day they built their last bomber, nobody cheered. Not because it wasn't a miracle, but because they'd run out of sound. June 28, 1945. The sun climbed over the long roof of Willow Run, catching the silver wing of a lone B-24 as it rolled toward the hangar doors. No speeches, no trumpets, only the familiar noises, the click of tools, the hiss of a fuel line, the shuffle of boots on concrete. For nearly 4 years, the factory had been a storm that never stopped. Now, at last, there was calm. The workers gathered quietly along the walls. Men with calloused hands, women with grease on their sleeves. Some had built hundreds of planes, others only a few. None of them smiled. It felt too final. The air was heavy with memories, of sirens, of shouting, of the rhythm that had once ruled every hour of their lives. Charles Cast-Iron Sorensen, the man who had turned chaos into order, stood beside the line with his hat in his hands. He looked thinner, older, worn down by the very machine he'd built. "For years we built for war," he said softly. "Now we'll learn to build for peace." No one answered. They just watched as the engine started. The B-24 shuddered, roared, and came alive. The sound filled the factory, shaking the glass in its frames. Then, as the hangar doors opened, the bomber rolled into sunlight. Someone had scrawled in chalk beneath the cockpit, "To the end of the war, and the beginning of something new." It climbed slowly into the sky, engines echoing across the fields. The workers followed it until it vanished into the clouds, then stood in silence. No cheers, No whistles. Only the strange emptiness of an ending. Inside, the noise that had once defined them was gone. Machines were shut down. Lights flickered out. A woman in coveralls polished her rivet gun one last time, then wrapped it in cloth like a relic. "She's done her duty," she whispered. A notice on the board carried the numbers everyone knew by heart. 8,685 bombers built. Production suspended, effective immediately. For a moment, no one moved. Some people folded the memo and slipped it into their pockets, as if keeping a piece of history might help them understand it. They wandered through the long, empty space that had once been alive with motion, pointing to spots only they would remember. "That's where the tail sections met. That's where I burned my hand on the first job. That's where I met her." The factory floor was littered with scraps of aluminum and bits of chalk dust, as if time itself had left its fingerprints. Edsel Ford was gone. His father, Henry, too frail to visit, sent a short message. "To those who labored with us, your work helped shorten the war and save lives. The nation thanks you." The words were read aloud, but few heard them over the silence in their heads. By dusk, the last crew gathered at the gate. They lingered, unsure what to do next. For years, their days had been measured by the sound of the whistle, the vibration of machines, the roar of bombers overhead. Now there was only stillness. Mary Johnson, the riveter who'd worked every shift since 1942, unpinned her badge, Wing Assembly, and slid it into her pocket. "We did it," she said quietly. "But now what?" No one had an answer. That night, the factory lights went dark for the first time in years. The huge, empty space felt like a sleeping giant, silent, waiting, remembering. Outside, the airstrip shimmered under moonlight. A single guard walked its length, lantern in hand, listening to the wind whistle through the rafters. "Strange," he said to himself. "You spend years fighting the clock, then one day, it just stops." The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, it was ending fast. Across the ocean, the bombers from Willow Run, Ford Flyer, Rosie's Revenge, Spirit of Detroit, were returning home, battered but alive. They had done their job. In Michigan, the factory that had once defined the word impossible now stood still. People said it was the end. But in truth, it was something else, a pause before a new beginning. Because Willow Run had never just built planes. It had built proof that ordinary hands, when moved by belief, could change the world. They'd beaten the clock. And then, for the first time, they let it rest. Years later, the old hangars still smelled of oil and hope. Grass pushed through the cracks in the concrete. But the shape of the place hadn't changed. The long, endless line where thousands once stood shoulder to shoulder, building something the world said couldn't be built. It was quiet now. Only the wind moved through the rafters, carrying the faint echo of hammers and engines that had stopped decades ago. On the far wall, faded letters still read, "Keep him flying." After the war, Willow Run stood empty for a time. Too big to fill, too full of ghosts to ignore. Then the space began to find new life. First came the engineers, testing new aircraft for the Cold War. Then the historians, walking through the silent bays with notebooks and cameras, trying to understand how this place had changed the world. But the first to come back were the people who had built it. In the late 1940s, reunions began. They were small at first, a handful of men and women who arrived in their Sunday clothes, walking the factory floor as if afraid to wake it. They touched the walls, traced the grooves where bolts had once held machines, and smiled at memories that no one else could see. One woman, gray-haired now, stopped near the old assembly line and said quietly, "We didn't just build bombers. We built proof that we could do the impossible." By the 1950s, the world had changed again. The Ford plant became a testing site, then an airport, then something half-living, part industry, part museum. Yet for those who had been there, it remained sacred ground. Veterans of the war sent letters from across the ocean. Some wrote simply, "Thank you for the wings that brought us home." In one archive, historians later found a letter from a British pilot named Alan Reeves, who had flown a B-24 built at Willow Run in 1944. "We were hit over Cologne," he wrote. 2 engines gone, half the tail missing. But she held together all the way back to base. Tell the people who built her, they saved 7 lives that night. That letter was framed and hung near the entrance of the Yankee Air Museum decades later. Beneath it, a small sign read. The arsenal of democracy was not a slogan. It was a promise kept. By the 1970s, a new generation knew Willow Run only as a story, a myth of America's industrial heart, when factories built not for profit but for purpose. The workers who had once called it home were aging now. Some returned each year for commemorations, wearing badges that had long since lost their shine. They stood by the runway and watched restored B-24s fly overhead, their engines roaring like echoes from another lifetime. Mary Johnson came once more in 1977, the year the bridge to the old test airfield was renamed for the plant's most famous plane, the Spirit of Willow Run. She carried a small envelope with a photograph of her crew, taken in 1943, black and white, and smudged with fingerprints. She placed it on a display table beside a piece of riveted aluminum. "We worked ourselves to the bone," she said to a reporter nearby. "But every sound in this place meant someone else might live." The reporter asked if she missed those days. Mary smiled, shook her head. "No one misses war. But I miss believing we could fix the world with our hands." In the 1980s, the government almost tore the plant down. It was too large, too old, too expensive to maintain. But a group of veterans and volunteers fought to save part of it, the original mile-long section of the assembly line. They said it wasn't just a building. It was a heartbeat. In 2013, after years of fundraising, they won. The line was preserved and became part of the Yankee Air Museum. Children now walk through it on school trips, running their fingers over rivet holes and asking what it felt like to build an airplane from nothing. Guides tell them about Rosie the Riveter, about Ford's Promise, about how ordinary men and women built 8,000 bombers in a race against time. And somewhere in the rafters, the old sound still seems to hum, faint, steady, alive. The legacy of Willow Run isn't just in the planes that flew or the records that were broken. It's in the idea that faith, discipline, and shared purpose could turn steel into freedom. It's in every factory worker who believed that tightening one bolt could help end a war an ocean away. One historian put it best during a memorial ceremony. They built weapons, yes, but what they really built was hope, cast, welded, and riveted into shape. When the ceremony ended, a restored B-24, one of the last in the world, took off from the old runway. Its engines thundered across the fields, rattling windows in distant farmhouses. People looked up and waved, just as they had in 1943. As the plane climbed, the crowd fell silent. The sound faded, but no one moved. It was the same silence that had filled the factory the day the last bomber left. The silence of completion. In that quiet, it was easy to believe that Willow Run had never really stopped working, that it still lived in every engine, every hand that had built, every dream that refused to surrender. Every hour, a bomber had risen from the earth. But what truly took flight was belief.